Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah, and welcome to this series, The Parables from Exile to Return. And we've talked about how the parables are really the best known Bible stories and probably the best loved words of Yeshua, and what he shared with the folks in Jerusalem and the environs at that particular time. Well, we're going to talk about how the real return of the people, the real exile, would be over with what Yeshua accomplished on the tree. And so we've talked quite a bit about the language of exile, how the children of Israel were exiled into Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar, and how even in the first century, in times of Roman rule, they were still considered to be as if they were in exile. And exile, of course, meant they were no longer in the land, they no longer had their temple standing, they were kind of persona non grata. They had, in essence, lost their identity as they had moved out into the nations, Babylon, Egypt, etc. They were stateless, they were homeless, and the central institution of their life had been destroyed. Again, that was the temple. And the temple was ground zero for the entire life of Israel, from its judicial system, its economic system, its religious system. All of it is gone. And so this is the place they find themselves, even while they are back in the land in the first century, under Roman rule, under the rule of the Herods, and really under the rule of the temple leadership, because that temple leadership at that time was not the ones descended from Aaron, as they were supposed to be, the high priest, for example. And so the real return from exile had to do with Yeshua, and it's into this environment that he enters, and that the real forgiveness of sin, normally found in the temple, when they brought their offerings up to the temple, and they were forgiven for unintentional sin through all the various sacrifices. So it was in the place of the temple that forgiveness of sin was found. But yet in Yeshua, who represented the temple himself, remember he said, destroy this body and in 3 days I will raise it up. It was in him that true forgiveness of sin would be found. We talked about the parables and how when Yeshua was sharing with them, they were probably a common story of the day, a rabbinic parable that the people were perhaps familiar with, and yet Yeshua put an unusual spin, an unusual ending. What's significant about that is that the hearers would, of course, been familiar with the original ending, but now they were hearing a much different ending. And so now the hearers could choose which of the endings they thought would fit. So they could choose to follow the way of peace and become the light of the world through the kingdom and by the shed blood of Yeshua the Messiah, or they could violate the commandments, violate the covenant, and basically call down the wrath of the empire at that time, Rome, which was how God expressed his wrath. He generally used these empires, these kings, to show his wrath to the people, so the people actually experienced the wrath of God through other sources, that the instrument of his wrath would actually come from these empires, for example. But the whole idea was that God's wrath would come because they had, in fact, broken the covenant. And so Yeshua, in that context, is calling them to become a kingdom of priests. You'll remember that in the story of the Exodus and at the mountain, when Moses expressed to them that you are a kingdom of priests, a Kohanim of priests. You're supposed to function in that way. That you are a renewed people. This is the place where Israel became a nation under one God. They're a renewed people. And they were to be the light of the world. They were to be the light to the nations. How would the nations know about this one true God if it weren't for Israel taking that message out? And so really that's the message for us today, as Yeshua brings an end to exile in our own lives, so that God himself, his presence, can dwell in us, just the same way as the children of Israel went back to the land and were responsible to rebuild the house for God, to rebuild the temple, so that the place of the presence of God could be restored. and so that the light of God in that place could go forth throughout the entire world. That's how it's supposed to look in our lives as well. Our temple, if you will, does not replace the cosmic temple, but it is a way that God has provided to move his presence through the entire earth. It is supposed to move through the body of Messiah so that the world around it will be transformed and changed. And sometimes it just doesn't look like we're having much of an effect or an influence on the world around us. And so God calls us to something much different than he calls the nations, but we are supposed to be that light to the nations. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the show something about the Transfiguration, which is a sort of unique story found in several different places in the New Testament. Let me just read this from Luke chapter 9, verse 31. And it says, "And behold, two men talked with him," speaking of Yeshua, "on top of the mountain, one who were Moses, Moshe, and Elijah, who appeared in glory. And they spoke of his," generally translated departure, but they spoke of his exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So generally, whenever you read that particular verse, it's going to, the word departure would be placed in there. So it kind of sounds like he's leaving, getting out of Dodge. He's leaving Jerusalem, but it's talking about something much more. The Hebrew, the word there should really be exodus. That the two men, Elijah and Moses, that were with him on top of the mountain that the disciples saw, who appeared in glory and spoke of his exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. The exodus having to do with the end of exile and to be restored to the land. That's the message of the resurrection, the end of exile. And so the story of the Exodus, as you know, is the most important stories to the Jewish people. In Judaism today, everything refers back to that particular event of the Exodus in Egypt. And every Passover it is celebrated, and the story is told of how the children of Israel were left Egypt. They were in exile in Egypt, and they were delivered and out of Egypt, and they went into the wilderness to a mountain. And it was on that place where Moses, as king over the nation, received the commandments of God. And those commandments, what we call the Torah, are actually something in the ancient world called the testimonies. The Hebrew word would be the edut. So in the ancient world, every king was given an edut, or a testimony, in order for him to govern the nation that he ruled over, govern his empire. And so the edut, or the testimonies that were given to Moshe to govern the people was the Torah, and that would be the first 5 books. And so the instruction manual there for governing this new nation that is out in the wilderness. And so this is the language of the Exodus. This is the language of the exile ending and the restoring of the house of the Lord. So if we look out into the wilderness, what was certainly Moses received the edut, the testimonies, and what was the next thing that they did? They built a house, or a tabernacle, for the presence of God, so that the presence of God could dwell in their midst. And so always the language of coming out of exile, returning to the land, if you will, had something to do with rebuilding the house. And so it's not a different picture with Messiah, Yeshua. By our faith in Messiah, by the restoration of that covenant, we come out of exile, no longer held captive or slaved to the flesh, to what is oppressing us, and now we are responsible to build a house for the presence of God. And so this building up of the house, individually, but more importantly, corporately. We're corporately to build a house for the presence of God. So very interesting passage, and again, Yeshua is on a mountain. This is temple-type language. Whenever you see this language of mountain, it usually has something to do with the place of the presence of God himself. And of course, in the ancient world, that's where the gods dwelled, would be on mountains. And in ancient Mesopotamia, for example, there were no mountains in the southern area. in Sumer. This was what we call the alluvial plain, so they built something like a mountain, which was called a ziggurat, which was a sort of stair-step building that was contained fill dirt. There was nothing inside it, but it was the mountain for the God to dwell on when he came from his heavenly abode. So this language of Exodus, and is not speaking of his departure, but it's speaking of the end of exile. And again, the end of exile being associated with the building of the house. This is all about the kingdom language. And really this is the language that Yeshua is trying to communicate in his parables. How they can end their exile. How they can be restored and renewed. How they can be a new creation people. All of this kind of intimated in the story of the parables. Now, I have mentioned several times that even though Israel is in the land in the first century, they're still under occupation. And they're being occupied by a foreign entity. And so we can look back to the various exiles and we can say, who was it that stood in the way of Israel's freedom? Who prevented Israel from being free? So we know Jacob and family went down to Egypt, and they were probably in Egypt there 200 plus years. The total period goes back to what was talked with Abraham, about 400 years. But who stood in the way of Israel's freedom? First of all, in Egypt, we had Pharaoh, and now Pharaoh is as a god. This wasn't the case in Mesopotamia. The king would actually aspire to be as a god, but in ancient Egypt, Pharaoh was said to be as the god. He was equal to the god. So we had Pharaoh, and of course his whole pantheon of gods in ancient Egypt. They stood in the way of Israel's release or freedom. The mixed multitude that was with them in the exile stood in their way of their freedom as well. And then we move into later parts in the Bible through the prophets, etc. And we find that the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Greeks, all foreign empires stood in the way of Israel's freedom, though some do go back to the land. And when they go back to the land, the Samaritans who had remained behind stood in the way of their freedom and prevented them from building a temple, a place for the presence of God. Once again, because you remember the temple was destroyed in 586 BC, the temple that Solomon had built under the auspices of his father, King David, had been destroyed. And so there was a process that went forward of rebuilding through the Hasmoneans and the Herodians, etc. And then by the time we get to the first century, we find Rome, and basically Caesar, who ruled over Rome as a god, stood in the way of their freedom. The Herodian kings of the time stood in the way of their freedom. And finally, believe it or not, the temple leadership, because as I've mentioned earlier, the temple had become quite corrupt. Not everybody in it was corrupt, but the leadership itself were buying and selling and controlling people through commercial enterprises, commercial pursuits. They were served in league with Rome. There was plenty of graft and bribery to go around. It was not a holy and pure temple. Of course, Yeshua railed against this in the first century. But all these forces through history had arrayed themselves against Israel and prevented her from being free. The idea of coming out of exile and returning to the land signified that Israel had been humbled and that they had been redeemed. So when it was time for them to return, they had gone through that process of humbling themselves before their God and experiencing redemption in order to return. And that essentially the statement was being made as they come out of exile to return, their sin would be forgiven and the covenant that they had made with their God would be renewed. So when a temple was rebuilt, when Israel's temple or house was rebuilt, it was basically declaring that if you will, the dead had been raised to life, and there was now new creation. These people, this nation, was now a new creation. Was now, the covenant was restored between the nation and her God, and her sin had been forgiven, and the covenant renewed. So a temple rebuilt signified all that, and we can certainly make an application for us today. All these things would apply if our own house was being rebuilt and restored, that our sins had been forgiven and our covenant with God had been renewed. So we need to examine ourselves to see if that's the case. What God did in the Exodus in Egypt, the promise is that he will do again, and it is as though Israel was birthed through the birth canal of the Red Sea, the Red Sea, Yam Suf, Reed Sea, and came up through the other side, reborn as a nation. That's the picture of the end of exile, this restoration and new life coming forward in the land. And of course, what's the first thing they did when they went out to the wilderness? Again, they rebuilt a house. It was the tabernacle, a place for the presence of their God. And once that tabernacle was finished, God would become their king, and he would do what the prophets foretold that he would do. And so this pattern repeats itself as Israel comes out of Babylon and returned eventually. Of course, it's at that time Medo-Persia, returns to the land. It's like they are birthed out of a foreign empire back into the land in order for new life to come forth. That new life would come forth in the house of God. This is a pattern that is repeated over and over again, and we can see that clearly in the first century as well. All of this, again, in the context of the parables. There's really a lot to the background of what is being said in the parables. Now, I mentioned before, of course, King Solomon is the one who essentially responsible for writing the book of Proverbs under the instruction of his mother. And so it tells us, even in the very first verse of the book of Proverbs, is that things have been told in a riddle. So, we think of a riddle as being something that's hidden and you got to kind of figure out the answer to it. But it actually is a little different. You'll see that in just a second. Let me just reiterate that Proverbs is dealing with what we call wisdom language, wisdom literature. And many a time the story that's being told actually had a different meaning or another meaning. Some of this relates it takes us really back to the creation, but I don't want to go into that too much. This concept of wisdom literature with another meaning actually is not an invention of the Second Temple period. And this, of course, is our parable developed out of this. It's said that it likely developed, this idea of the wisdom literature with another meaning, developed when they were in exile, the exilic period in Babylon. And it was said that sort of a vision of the heavenly world would correspond to a specific situation on earth. Now, the word for riddle comes from the Hebrew chidah, which comes from the root word yachad. And yachad, of course, those of you who know some Hebrew know that it means one, echad. And so we get yachad, and from that we get chidah. They're all similar words. The idea is that the riddle or the chidah that's being told is something that separates the hearer from the one telling the parable, from the one telling the story. There's a separation that takes place. It's very interesting. Again, it's not translated in the same way that we would translate it. So the riddle or the chidah begins by dividing the hearer from the teller. So there's a separation, once again, between the two. Now, the riddle or the chidah ends with an answer, with a conclusion that unites the two. So it's a very interesting process. It's almost like the process of covenant, in which you take a whole, you separate it into parts in order and put it back together so that it produces life. That is the point of the riddle. The chidah is supposed to produce life. So it begins with a separation and it ends with the answer joining the two. A good example of this type of story is the story we have of Solomon, when the two women come in and both say that the baby belongs to them. And what is King Solomon's response is, okay, let's just cut these two babies in half. And you take one half and you take the other. And so the mother, the true mother, is willing to give up the baby in order not to cut the baby in half. But this is kind of a similar thing. This is separating the teller from the hearer in order to unite the two and bring some sort of response or some sort of conclusion to this particular story. And so it's a very interesting concept here that we have with the chidah and the yachad that would unite the two. So we'll just, I'll be talking a little bit more about this probably in our next session. But again, all this was about, this wisdom literature was all about uniting the people with God himself. It was a mechanism for bringing some sort of restoration between the two parties, as it did in that story that we have with Solomon, as he suggests us cutting the two babies in half. It's about a restoration of the two parts. So we're going to kind of close out this particular session. I've introduced a lot of material as we've gone through this series, with the hope that you will begin to see the importance of understanding the parables in their context and how there's really quite a bit of information to understand in order to appreciate what Yeshua is saying. So I talked in our last segment about this idea of the riddle, that it begins by dividing the hearer and the teller, but it ends by uniting the two parties. And so Yeshua would tell the story, tell the parable. He would end the parable with a different conclusion than what they were used to. And so it either united the listener with him in understanding the story, or they didn't get it. So it made no sense. Those were the sort of two options. And in essence, the hearer, the listener, could interpret this himself. He would choose, if you will, which ending that he wanted to go with. And clearly Yeshua's endings were very different than what they were used to. They were not at all used to what his conclusion was to these parables. Talks in the book of Proverbs about those who are wise will become wiser still, and that they will understand the Proverbs, the Mishlei, the parables, and obscure expressions and sayings. That was the purpose of this language. And of course, those that heard, that understand, would engage and receive the kingdom. This is all, again, kingdom language. It exposes to us what we call the world behind the veil, the world beyond time. That's what Yeshua was there to communicate with them, to help them cope with the suffering and the oppression that they were dealing with. It is just as if the riddle, these riddles were wisdom from the very throne of God. And let me just mention that the book of Proverbs starts this way. If you read the first chapter, I would encourage you to go back and read the first chapter, because it's dealing with this idea of these riddles, this obscure language, these parables and proverbs. These are sort of interchangeable terms, but it is the language of creation. It is the language of new creation. It is the language of restoration from exile. It is the language of the kingdom functioning as it's supposed to function. And so this is what the context for Yeshua. The New Testament tells us when he was alone, those around him with the 12 would ask about the parable or the mashal, and he would say, "To you has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God." Now, this doesn't mean that this is special revelation. This is hidden revelation. Nobody can figure it out but you. This is, you're in a special class all of your own. This is what we have a tendency to do, because somehow we get it and nobody else gets it. But that's not what he was communicating at all. He was communicating that, in essence, it's your choice. Do you want to receive the kingdom? Do you want to receive the conclusion that I have given to it? You have a choice. You can take it or you can leave it. But for those who heard it and received it and entertained it, there was a restoration, a unity then that is established between the king and his subjects. That's what it's about. It's not about hidden language in the Bible. We have a tendency to think that there's a lot of stuff in there that's sort of not meant for the average person. This is for special, and that nothing could be further from the truth. That is not how God presented it. So I hope I've given you quite a bit in this particular session here. I'm encouraging you to go back and to reread chapter 1 of the Proverbs for sure. And I would just suggest, there's 31 chapters, just taking a chapter a day for a month. And so that you can understand the language of the kingdom, the wisdom language that God has imparted to his kings in order to govern his subjects. And you take that same language and apply it in your home, and you will see your home transformed. Amen. See you next time. Thanks for joining me. Shalom.